Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into some malicious compliance stories. Today we've got 3 tales of people who took rules, expectations, and outright fraud and responded with precision, patience, and paperwork. One involves a railroad man who followed the no overtime rule so literally he parked a 2-mile train through the middle of a steel mill. Another, a high school bully who finally realized she'd been competing alone. And the last, an HOA president who tried to sell a house that wasn't his and ended up selling his own instead. Here we go. 1 man, 1 train, 1 rule, no overtime. The policy died that afternoon. This story goes back to the 1960s, long before corporate buzzwords and HR departments tried to smooth over bad management decisions. My grandfather-in-law was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. He was a World War II veteran, captured in Italy, escaped a POW camp, rejoined his unit, and kept fighting until the war was over. If anyone in that steel mill thought they could intimidate him with a memo and a time clock, they had no idea who they were dealing with. After the war, he worked for a steel mill that had its own internal rail system. He wasn't running cross-country freight, he was moving rail cars around the plant, hauling materials from one section to another, assembling trains for outgoing shipments, and shuffling cars where they needed to go. The mill was massive, split on either side of a river with a rail bridge connecting the 2 halves. The main tracks ran straight through both sections, cutting across internal roads and temporarily blocking traffic whenever a long string of cars rolled through. When he brought a full train across, it effectively shut down parts of the plant for a few minutes at a time. By the nature of the job, overtime happened. It wasn't dramatic, usually just an hour or 2 a week. The issue was simple logistics. If your shift ended at 3 in the afternoon and you were in the middle of hauling a mile-long line of cars through the mill, you couldn't exactly slam on the brakes, hop off, and leave it sitting there. You had to finish the move, park the engine properly, and hand it off to your relief. Management understood this for years, and it was just part of doing business. Then, one day, some bright executive decided overtime was the enemy. A shiny new rule came down from above: no overtime, no exceptions. It didn't matter what job you did or where you were when the clock hit 3. The rule was presented like a bold, cost-saving initiative, the kind that looks fantastic in a quarterly report and disastrous in real life. The supervisors were instructed to enforce it strictly. My grandfather-in-law read the memo, nodded once, and said nothing. He wasn't the type to argue policy in the break room. Instead, he watched and waited. For a couple of weeks, he paid careful attention to the timing of his routes, the length of the trains, and the precise position of the engine at various points in the afternoon. He knew exactly how long it took to move a full set of cars from one side of the mill to the other. This is the setup. Months of watching, measuring, waiting. He didn't argue the rule, he just figured out exactly how to apply it. A man who escaped a POW camp knows how to wait for the right moment. One afternoon, he got it just right. By a little before 3, he had nearly 2 miles of rail cars coupled behind his engine. The train stretched from one section of the mill, across the river bridge, and deep into the other side. Internal roads were blocked in multiple spots as he crawled through. When the clock in the cab ticked over to 3 p.m., he eased the throttle back and stopped the engine in a position that would be impossible to ignore. He parked the locomotive directly beside the time clock building, not in the yard, not out of the way, right by the time clock. He shut it down, climbed out, and walked inside. He punched his card exactly at 3 p.m. as required by the new rule. Then he put on his jacket and went home. Behind him sat 2 miles of rail cars cutting through the heart of the mill. Production was effectively split in half. Trucks couldn't cross certain internal roads. Equipment was stuck on one side of the bridge while material sat idle on the other. Supervisors scrambled, first assuming he'd stepped away briefly. When they realized he'd left for the day, the panic began. They tried to call him, but this was the 1960s. There were no cell phones, and once he left the mill, he was gone. His relief couldn't immediately take over because the engine wasn't returned to its usual handoff point. Getting someone else qualified to operate it and reposition everything wasn't a 5-minute fix. The ripple effect through the plant lasted hours. The bosses were furious. From their perspective, he'd intentionally sabotaged operations. From his perspective, he'd followed the rule exactly as written. His shift ended at 3, overtime was forbidden, no exceptions, He had complied perfectly. Management floated the idea of disciplining him. I don't remember the exact details of what they threatened, but it didn't get far. The union stepped in immediately. Their argument was simple. The company had implemented a blanket no overtime policy with no operational flexibility. He had obeyed it. If they wanted trains moved after 3, they were free to authorize overtime or adjust scheduling. Nothing happened to him. Not a write-up, not a suspension. The next day, the policy was quietly revised. Overtime was once again permitted for essential operations. Funny how quickly no exceptions becomes negotiable when the entire plant grinds to a halt. He never bragged about the stunt. He'd tell it like it was just common sense. But everyone at that mill knew exactly what had happened. A man who survived a POW camp wasn't going to be bullied by a payroll spreadsheet. And if management wanted to play hardball with a railroad man, they'd better be ready for the train to stop exactly where he chose. Grandpa sounds like a guy that would have worn a red bandana at Blair Mountain. Respect. And our second story. My high school bully's favorite hobby was one-upping me. At a reunion, I told her about my life, and she walked away mid-conversation. I was reminded of this recently when I went back to my alma mater for a marching band reunion during homecoming. Standing there in the stadium watching the current band file onto the field, I suddenly remembered a girl from high school who had made it her personal mission to compete with me over absolutely everything. It wasn't some dramatic rivalry or big public feud. It was the kind of petty, low-grade antagonism that only really exists in high school hallways and band rooms. At the time, it felt exhausting. Looking back now, it's almost impressive how much energy she invested in trying to outshine someone who wasn't even competing with her. We weren't in the same grade, but we shared a few classes and were both in band. For reasons I still don't understand, she decided one day that I was her target. It started small. She'd talk over me in sectionals or make little comments that were just sharp enough to sting without being obvious enough to call out. During pep band, she had a habit of accidentally blasting her trumpet right behind my ear or nudging my music folder so I'd lose my place. If I reached for a page turn, it might mysteriously flip early. All technically minor, all very intentional. The one-upsmanship was constant and bizarre. If I mentioned I'd gotten an A on a history test, she'd immediately say, "Oh, I got a 98 on my calculus exam." We weren't in the same class. It didn't matter. If I said I bought a new CD, she'd inform me she'd had it for weeks. When I showed up wearing a new pair of jeans I was proud of, she'd glance down and say, "Oh, those aren't in-brand, are they?" It was relentless and completely pointless. Like she'd built her personality around beating me at imaginary competitions. That's the part that makes no sense. She built this whole competition in her head. You were just living your life. The mental energy required to track someone else's achievements that closely just so you can one-up them? Exhausting. The thing is, I wasn't trying to compete. I was just existing. I had friends, I liked band, I did well in school. Her behavior confused me more than anything. I'd rack my brain trying to remember if I'd insulted her once or taken a solo she wanted. Nothing ever surfaced. Eventually, I stopped reacting, which seemed to frustrate her more. Then I graduated. I went to college just across the state border and joined the university marching band. It was massive compared to my high school band. When I graduated, our high school program had barely 50 members. My college band started at around 250 and grew to over 300 within a year. It was loud, organized chaos in the best way. I threw myself into it and honestly didn't think about her again. 2 summers later, I went home for our town's annual summer celebration. It's one of those small-town events where everyone shows up, alumni included. I was standing with a few friends near the food trucks when she materialized next to us, like she'd been waiting for the opportunity. She gave me this tight little smile and said, "I hear you joined the marching band at U. It can't be all that big, though." I blinked at her, trying to process the tone. "Actually, it was around 250 when I started," I said casually. "We've got about 330 now." I wasn't bragging, it was just a fact. I could almost see the gears stutter for a second. Our high school band had been tiny. This wasn't the answer she expected. She recovered quickly. "Well, I'm in my college's marching band too," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "We've been invited to perform halftime for an NFL team this fall." There it was again, the same old move. present something impressive, wait for me to be dazzled, then claim victory in a competition I didn't know we were in? I smiled. Oh, that's awesome. You'll have so much fun. I paused just long enough to let it land naturally. We did halftime for an NFL team my freshman year. It was a blast. We were offered that same trip again this season, but we had to turn it down because we got picked to march at a major national event instead. The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't anger exactly, more like recalculating. I hadn't argued, I hadn't tried to top her. I'd simply responded with my own experience, which happened to be bigger. She glanced over my shoulder and suddenly seemed very interested in someone else across the way. Oh well, I need to go say hi, she muttered, already pivoting away. And that was it. No dramatic confrontation, no final insult. She just exited the conversation because there was nothing left to one up. For the first time, I hadn't been the underdog in her imagined hierarchy. I hadn't even tried to win. I just calmly stated facts and let them sit there. I never had to deal with her passive-aggressive nonsense again. We graduated, moved on, built our own lives. Seeing her at that summer celebration was the last time we spoke. At the reunion recently, standing among hundreds of band members and listening to the roar of the crowd, I couldn't help but laugh at how much space she once occupied in my teenage brain. High school's strange like that. Someone can decide you're their rival without consulting you and spend years dodging invisible jabs. In the end, the most satisfying response wasn't a clever insult or a public takedown. It was simply living well enough that her comparisons didn't hold up anymore. And judging by how quickly she found someone else to talk to that day, I'd say she finally realized she'd been competing alone the entire time. And our last story. The HOA president fabricated liens, forged signatures, and sold my friend's house to an innocent family. This happened to a friend of mine a few years back, and every time I retell it, it still sounds like something that should have ended with police lights in a Netflix documentary. We live in a small rural farming community that's been up and coming for about a decade now. A lot of the older farmers have been selling off their land as development creeps in. When that happens, there are usually two options: split the land into smaller lots and sell them individually for more profit over time, or sell the entire parcel at once for a quicker, smaller payout. One particular farmer decided to maximize his return and sell in lots. The land sat right next to a developing neighborhood, so the demand was there. My friend, a semi-retired doctor who split his time between here and the south, bought several of the lots in the middle and built himself a beautiful custom home. He spared no expense. Stonework wraparound porch, massive windows overlooking what used to be open fields. He chose the central location for the view, never imagining that center of the subdivision might one day become a liability. A year or so later, a development company came in and bought most of the remaining lots. They built a full subdivision around them, designing the homes in a similar architectural style to keep everything looking cohesive. They definitely cut corners compared to his place, but aesthetically it all blended well. My friend didn't mind. If anything, the matching style boosted his property value. He'd essentially become the anchor property in the middle of their shiny new neighborhood. The development company also formed an HOA. Of course they did. They sent my friend multiple invitations to join, emphasizing community standards and shared amenities. He politely declined every time. Due to the way he purchased his land before the HOA was formed, there were legal protections in place that meant he was not required to join. He maintained friendly relationships with the original HOA president and even attended a few neighborhood events as a courtesy. Things were civil for years. Then the HOA got a new president. This man apparently skipped the part where you read governing documents before flexing authority. He began sending my friend letters about violations, things like landscaping inconsistencies, mailbox style, even minor exterior paint differences. Along with these notices came late fees for unpaid HOA dues. My friend responded in writing, calmly explaining that he was not and never had been a member of the HOA. The new president dismissed it as if my friend were confused about his own property. My friend ignored the fines because they had no legal standing. Meanwhile, he continued his normal routine. He was what people call a snowbird, spending winters working part-time at a hospital in the south and summers back here. He owned both properties and had done this for years without issue. Unfortunately, the new HOA president knew this schedule. While my friend was away for the winter, the HOA president escalated things in a way that still makes my blood boil. He fabricated documentation claiming my friend had unpaid dues and was in violation of HOA rules. He pushed through what he called an eviction process, even though you can't evict someone from a property you don't own. Then, using a real estate contact who was apparently more interested in commission than due diligence, he arranged for the home to be sold. Yes, sold, while the actual owner was out of state. That's the part that still doesn't feel real. He didn't just send angry letters, he fabricated documents, pushed a fake eviction, and sold the house, all while the actual owner was hours away, living his normal life. The audacity of it is staggering. My friend returned in early spring, suitcase in hand, expecting to unlock his door and air out the house. Instead, his key didn't work. At first, he assumed the lock had jammed. Then a woman he'd never seen before opened the door and asked why he was on her porch. Behind her were moving boxes and someone else's furniture inside his living room. He stood there stunned and said, "I think there's been a mistake. This is my house." The family inside had purchased the property through what they believed was a legitimate sale. They had a mortgage, paperwork, everything. They were just as shocked as he was. Within hours, police were involved, and so were lawyers. My friend contacted a lawyer he knew from his hospital work down south. This was not a small-town general practice attorney. This was someone who specialized in complex property and fraud cases. Once the paperwork was reviewed, the fraud was obvious. The HOA had no authority over his property, no lien rights, and no legal pathway to sell it. The documents filed to justify the sale were riddled with inconsistencies and outright falsehoods. The family who had purchased the house joined the lawsuit almost immediately. They had taken out a substantial loan and moved their lives into what they believed was their new home. They had to be relocated on short notice, deal with lenders, and untangle a mess that wasn't of their making. They were furious, and rightfully so. The lawsuit didn't drag on long. Big city legal firepower versus a small-town HOA president operating on ego and assumption isn't much of a contest. The court ruled decisively. The sale was voided, the title restored to my friend, and substantial damages were awarded. The development company distanced itself from the president, claiming he had acted independently and outside the scope of his authority. As for the HOA president, the fallout was brutal. He was personally named in parts of the lawsuit due to clear evidence of intentional misconduct. Insurance didn't fully cover what he'd done. From what I understand, he was forced to sell his own home to cover legal costs and settlements. Not long after, he skipped town. My friend eventually moved back into his house after the legal dust settled. The displaced family received compensation and found another place. The HOA is still technically in existence, but they've been extremely careful about who they send violation letters to ever since. Apparently, they've also developed a newfound appreciation for reading their own governing documents before attempting a hostile takeover of someone's living room. Turns out that trying to evict and sell a man's house while he's out of state is not a minor paperwork error, and if you're gonna gamble with someone's property, you better hope they don't have friends who specialize in dismantling fraud for a living. 3 different kinds of victory. Story 1 was patience as leverage. The grandfather-in-law didn't fight the policy. He just waited for the right moment to apply it exactly as written. 2 miles of train, a parked locomotive, and a plant split in half. Management learned that no exceptions means nothing when operations depends on people who actually know how to read a clock. Story 2 was existence as victory. The bully spent years competing with someone who wasn't playing. When the OP finally responded with calm facts, bigger band, NFL halftime, national events, the one-upper had nothing left to say. She walked away mid-conversation because the game only worked when the other person cared. And as a tradition, Story 3 wins. Not because of the money, though the damages were substantial, but because of the symmetry. The HOA president tried to sell someone else's house. He ended up selling his own to cover the legal fallout. He fabricated documents, forged signatures, and gambled with someone's life. And when the real owner came back with a serious lawyer, the house of cards collapsed so completely that the president had to leave town. That's not just justice, that's poetry. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.